We could hear the guns go booming, remembered slave Richard Mooring.
War had finally come to North Carolina.
The fighting here was the last bloody battle of the Civil War for many.
Morrisville witnessed more than the end of the Civil War, but also the end of a way of warfare. No longer would mounted soldiers fight as part of military armies. It was the cavalryman's last huzzah. The long road that brought the two generals together in Morrisville began as the city of Atlanta burned. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman captured the city in September 1864 and marched his army across Georgia to Savannah, destroying everything in its path. It was a campaign that exposed the Southerners to the hard hand of war in hopes of weakening the Confederacy's will to fight. Leading Sherman's cavalry was a vain new West Point graduate who fought his way across the South with a harem in tow.
General Sherman considered General Judson Kilpatrick an ambitious and cocky commander who had earned the nickname Kill Cavalry for his recklessness with the lives of his men. In January 1865, Kilpatrick and the rest of Sherman's Union Army marched north through the Carolinas with the hopes of joining Union forces in Virginia. Kilpatrick's Confederate counterpart was known as Fightin' Joe. Joseph Wheeler was a West Point graduate like Kilpatrick who had written the Confederacy's book on cavalry tactics in 1863. After the fall of Atlanta, his men were tasked with stopping Sherman. Across the South, these men would earn the reputation of being hard but undisciplined fighters.
Friend and foe alike cursed Wheeler and his men as lawless criminals. Confederate horsemen commandeered horses, robbed civilians, and some began executing Union prisoners.
In 1865, Wheeler joined Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's gathering army in North Carolina. Johnston launched an all-out assault against a portion of Sherman's army on March 19th near the village of Bentonville. It was the last great charge of the Army of Tennessee, but it failed to destroy Sherman. Johnston retreated only to learn the devastating news of the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. By April 12th, Sherman had resupplied at Goldsboro and fought his way to within sight of Raleigh's earthworks.
Panicked citizens fled the capital throughout the night as Confederate authorities desperately loaded trains with important supplies and wounded. Johnston had his railroad engines working overtime, shuttling wounded men and supplies away from Raleigh in order to keep them out of Union hands.
One of the wounded rattling down the tracks through the night was General Daniel Reynolds.
His train pulled into the small depot town of Morrisville. With the stump of his amputated leg throbbing, Reynolds spent an uneasy night listening to the movements of Johnston's army and the groans of the other wounded. The campfires of Wheeler's ragged forces filled the woods just outside Raleigh. They believed Kilpatrick would rest, content with capturing another Southern capital. But with victory at hand, Kilpatrick's horsemen were eager to finish off Johnston's crippled army. morning dawned wet and gloomy. Kilpatrick's troopers entered Raleigh to the accompaniment of their regimental band. They cut down the Confederate flag flying above the State House and hoisted the Stars and Stripes. They wasted little time celebrating. Cavalry set out to find and destroy William's command. The Federals surprised the rebel force and just sat down to eat breakfast. The Union troopers charged the camp, hacking with sabers and firing pistols. For the next 6 hours, the fighting became a running battle that rolled down the railroad west towards Morrisville. Ahead of his army, General Wheeler entered Morrisville and discovered a dangerous situation developing. In the station, he found a single engine attempting to pull a train full of rations and wounded soldiers up the long slope out of town. Wheeler knew that the train was moving too slow to avoid being captured by the Federals. He could not stop Kilpatrick's force, but he knew something had to be done to save the train. Quickly, Wheeler ordered the men of General William Hume's and General William Allen's divisions to dismount and throw up barricades around the station, hoping to buy time for the train to escape. General Kilpatrick soon reached the heights above Morrisville and saw his chance to put another nail in the Confederacy's coffin. He ordered his artillery to start shelling the town and maneuvered his 1st Brigade into position for a charge. Lieutenant Joseph Kittinger of the 23rd New York Light Artillery remembered the scene. When we reached the brow of the hill overlooking this place, we saw a long, heavy rebel column of cavalry passing through the town and up the opposite heights. My pieces were brought forward on a run, and we sent the shell in quick succession right in the midst of the retreating Johnnies, scattering them in every direction. Soldiers and townspeople scrambled for cover. Malchus Page and his family hid in the basement of their home, which stood in the thick of the battle. Having hidden their silverware and jewelry, they now prayed to live to reclaim their valuables. Kittinger's rifled cannons sent shell flying through barns, houses, and flesh, but rebel cavalrymen returned the fire, making it hot work for the Union cannoneers. Officers on Reynolds' staff were in the engine with the conductor, motivating him to move the train. Reynolds noted that numerous threats were made to kill the conductor if he allowed them to fall into Federal hands. Kilpatrick ordered the brigade of General Thomas J. Jordan into action. The 2nd and 3rd Kentucky, 9th Pennsylvania, and the 8th Indiana Cavalry were moved into position. When the bugles sounded, they dashed towards the slow-moving train. 2 Confederates of the 4th Tennessee Cavalry, Lieutenants Hugh Preston and Joe Massengale, fell wounded from the saddle, shouting at their men to concentrate fire on the quickly advancing Federals. The Confederates now concentrated their fire on the quickly advancing Federals. The blue troopers thundered over the ground and closed to within 150 yards, before withering enemy fire convinced them they didn't want to add to Kilpatrick's reckless reputation. Wheeler knew he could not defend the train for much longer and made a critical decision. He ordered the train lightened by uncoupling the supply cars, leaving the cars of wounded to escape. The black engine now pulled up the slope toward Durham Station, and the Confederate cavalry retreated. The prize had slipped out of Kilpatrick's hands.
Wheeler had saved his men, but lost the vital supplies Johnston's army needed to survive. Kilpatrick stormed into town and ordered pursuit. With the sound of battle raging to the west of Morrisville, he sat down to send Sherman a dispatch describing the day's fighting. Kilpatrick's inflated ego caused him to boast that the Confederates were totally demoralized, but that he had fought over nearly every foot of ground from Raleigh to this point. Kilpatrick's men informed captured Confederates of Lee's surrender in Virginia. The prisoners confessed that after the hard fighting that morning, they thought that there was something the matter. Attesting to the ferocity of the day's fighting, Kittinger recorded in his diary that his 2 guns fired at least 88 rounds of percussion and case shot. That night, spring rain soaked the living and the dead in Morrisville. A Confederate courier approached the Federal camp in Morrisville. He carried a dispatch from General Johnston requesting a meeting with General Sherman to discuss the possibility of surrender. Sherman agreed to armistice. He would limit the advance of his infantry to Morrisville, then meet Johnston the next day. Sherman boarded a train in Raleigh for his encounter with his old adversary. Before leaving the station, he received a disturbing telegram. He stopped his train in Morrisville and ordered his commanders to wait for his return. After meeting Johnston, Sherman again stopped in Morrisville, where he revealed the shocking news of President Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln's death pierced the heart of the nation. Union soldiers in Morrisville were stunned by the worst news of the long war. Joseph Johnston's note, sent to Morrisville, would lead to an historic agreement in the Durham farmhouse of James Bennett. It was the largest surrender of the war and brought peace to a war-torn land. Morrisville had seen the dawn of peace. Johnston's offer of armistice, received in Morrisville, led to the largest surrender of the Civil War. Morrisville had also witnessed the last major cavalry clash of the war. It was the end of an era when mounted soldiers dominated the battlefield. The mounted trooper and the iconic blade he carried would soon disappear into time. The end of the Civil War marked the twilight of Sabers.